Hey, my name's Matt Kennedy, and this is the Steadfast Podcast. This podcast exists to use Bible study and theological teaching to encourage you to be steadfast in your faith. Thank you for taking time out of your day to check out the Steadfast Podcast. I hope today's episode is an encouragement to you. Last week, we talked about Satan entering into Judas. Judas and the religious leaders, they were plotting against Jesus, and maybe the biggest betrayal in all of history. Remember, we are in the final week leading up to the crucifixion. It's difficult to tell whether their plotting happened on Tuesday or Wednesday of that week, but it doesn't really matter. It will soon become clear why we think it was Tuesday or Wednesday, because now we are at Thursday. Remember, Jesus will be crucified Friday morning, and yet there are several big events left for us to cover. Today, we're going to look at the Lord's Supper, which we also call communion. And kind of like a funny thing is this weekend at the church I'm at, I actually preached on communion. We had communion, we celebrated communion, and if I was better at planning the podcast and my teaching that is associated to my job, then I could have used the same notes. But because I'm not great at planning, I actually did this twice over. So we're going a little bit different angle. If you did happen to hear my sermon from Sunday, then there's going to be some things that you've heard before, some overlap. But in large part, we've taken very different angles for this. Okay? So here we go. Our first point, the Lord's Supper shows us his control. The Lord's Supper shows us his control. We're going to be in Luke chapter 22. Starting in verse 7, quote, "Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. So Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, 'Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat it.' They said to him, 'Where will you have us prepare it?' He said to them, 'Behold, when you have entered the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him into the house that he enters, and tell the master of the house, the teacher says to you, where's the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And he will show you a large upper room furnished. Prepare it there.' And they went and found it just as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover." End quote. Jesus gave Peter and John some very specific directions on what they were supposed to do. Their job was to go and to prepare the Passover meal for their whole group. Verse 10 describes a man carrying a jar of water, and that really would have stood out for Peter and John, because typically it was women who went to the well to fill their water jars, and typically they did that very early in the morning because the heat was crazy. So this man would have been a unique road sign for the disciples. They would not have had to figure out, all right, which man with the jar are we talking about? There would have only been one. Think about what this means, though. That every step that this man took in his day and in the household he is a part of, all of that was under the control of God, so that this man would cross paths with Peter and John at that particular moment. This means that every step was planned. Perhaps his wife normally filled the jar in the morning hours, but she had something come up that day. Perhaps she was under the weather, and this man filled in where he was needed. We don't know why he was there, only that he was there exactly where Jesus said he would be, and then it would be a little bit unusual for this situation to play out the way it does, which leads us to believe it is divinely orchestrated. We can get impressed when someone calls their shot in basketball, but Jesus knew every detail of what was about to happen, even who Peter and John would pass on the street. Jesus knew the man would lead them to a house with a large furnished upper room, and that the homeowner would let them use that space simply because Jesus asked for it. Now, doesn't this ring a little bit familiar? You may remember at the end of chapter 19, Jesus told the disciples where to go get a colt, and how every step of that interaction would go, and it went just as he said. I want you to think about the words of Proverbs chapter 16, verse 33, quote, "The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord," end quote. Even the most seemingly random things are under God's control. Whether he causes an event or he allows an event, nothing goes outside of his control. This section is a great reminder that God is in control. Nothing catches him off guard. He knows every step of your life, every thought you'll think, the number of hairs on your head at any given moment. Our God is a really big God that knows everything and cannot be caught off guard. Nothing that comes up in your life will surprise God. He's already in your future. You can have every confidence in him because he is that great. In my view, one of the weaknesses of the average believer's theology is the bigness of God, the sovereignty of God, the omnipotence of God. Because listen, Colossians chapter 1, verses 16 and 17 says, quote, "For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together." End quote. This verse is talking about Jesus. It is by the power of Jesus that all things were created. In verse 17, it is by him that all things hold together. I want you to think about how powerful this is. By the power of Jesus, our earth was made. Now, our Earth is the 5th largest planet in our solar system. Now, do you know how big that is? If you're at the equator, it's about 24,901 miles around the planet. If you don't think that sounds far, start running and get back to me. There are 2,000 pounds in a ton, and our Earth weighs about 6.6 sextillion tons. That's 6, 6, and 20 zeros. This planet that is 24,901 miles around and 6.6 sextillion tons is currently spinning at about 1,000 miles per hour, while it is orbiting the sun at about 67,000 miles per hour, and you can't even feel it move. God created this home we live on, and he tuned it perfectly for us, for life to exist. For more on fine-tuning, you can read up on the theological argument for God. One place to check that out is Dr. Frank Turek's book called "I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist" is a great place to start. I know that's a weird name for a book, "I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist," but he really unpacks the teleological and the cosmological arguments for God's existence that you may benefit from. Now listen, so it was by the power of Jesus that our earth was made. It is by the power of Jesus that the sun was made. Speaking of the sun, did you know it's about 1 million times the size of the earth? How big is that? Did you know that it puts off the same amount of energy as 1 trillion atomic bombs every single second? Wait for it. 1 Mississippi. It just produced 1 trillion atomic bombs because the power of Jesus holds all things together. Wait, 1 Mississippi. Did you count that? 1 trillion more atomic bombs worth of energy because it is by the power of Jesus the sun holds together. By the time you've listened to this podcast episode, I'm going to estimate, if my math is right, that the sun has produced more energy than 1,300,000,000,000,000,000,000,000 atomic bombs. Man, that makes this episode sound so long. Now, how big is an atomic bomb? Well, when the U.S. dropped an atomic bomb over Hiroshima during World War II, an estimated 80,000 people died. Then tens of thousands others would die from radiation. An estimated 60,000 of the city's 90,000 structures were completely destroyed. That's one. Actually, technically, that's not even one. I went down a rabbit hole of research that took way too much time, and the atomic power we are talking about with the sun is actually a megaton atomic bomb, which is about 67 times more powerful, the size of what hit Hiroshima. So if you're doing the math, and it's okay if you're not taking notes, I'm going to spell it out for you. The sun produces about 67 trillion times the power of what hit Hiroshima every single second. 67 trillion. The most violent and powerful attack that mankind has ever produced against its fellow man is done 67 trillion times over every single second by the star in our solar system. That is absolutely crazy. The bigness of God is present with that sheer power. But do you know what else is crazy? While we can't truly know how many stars are out there, scientists think there are around 3 septillion other suns out there. That is the number 3 with 24 zeros at the end of it. 3 septillion other suns producing 67 trillion times the power of what hit Hiroshima every single second. They say there are more stars out there than grains of sand on our planet. How big is our God? His sovereignty is not just concerned with the gigantic. Let's talk about something smaller if we can. You have about 37 trillion cells in your body. That's small. Big number, small cells. Then they do different things. Every single second, about 1,000,000 cells in your body die, and a fresh 1,000,000 cells come to life. You know how they all function? The power of Jesus holds those things together. Your heart, hopefully, is currently beating because of the power of God. Your lungs inhale and exhale because of the power and grace of God in your life. The same is true for about 8 billion other people on this planet, and Lord knows how many animals and other creepy things on the earth. You know how Jesus is able to heal all the blind, the sick, the lepers, the paralytic, and others? Because the power of God has control over every single cell in every single body. Our body, our planet, our sun, the whole universe has to obey the command of our God. Listen, God is so much bigger than you give him credit for. God is bigger, he is greater than you can possibly understand. Fact is, we are just talking about what he has done, not his limit. The only limitations to God are things outside of his character. For example, he cannot lie. But there is no limitation to his power. There is no limitation to his strength. That is how great our God is. However you view God, you need to understand that he is bigger and he is greater than words can even begin to describe. Now that we've taken a lengthy detour on the bigness of God, as we see by him sovereignly mapping out how this day would go, let's get back to that Lord's Supper. Remember, Jesus called exactly who would be where and what the disciples needed to do, where they needed to go, how it would be set up so that the Passover meal could be celebrated by this group. So now all that's done, it's dinner time, which leads us to our second point, number 2. The Lord's Supper helps us anticipate the future. The Lord's Supper helps us anticipate the future. We're going to pick up in verse 14, quote, "And when the hour came, he reclined at table, and the apostles with him. And he said to them, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." End quote. All right, all the preparations are complete. The meal is ready. Everyone is gathered around in the upper room. They're reclining at table in a moment of comfort before a long and difficult night. Sometimes Greek to English is a little bit different. Quite literally, this translates as, "With desire I have desired." The point is that Jesus has put this moment on his calendar. He knows what comes next. But before that comes, Jesus has some important things to say to his friends. Verse 16 and following, quote, "For I tell you, I will not eat it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God." And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he said, "Take this and divide it among yourselves. For I tell you that from now on, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes." End quote. On this day of celebration, remember, the Passover was like the Jewish Easter. Big deal for them. Everyone would make a sacrifice. Jesus is well aware that this is his last meal. In verse 15, he told his followers that he wanted to do this before he suffers. He knew what was coming. Why? Because he planned it. He is the one making the sacrifice. How wild is that? In these verses, Jesus is pointing to a future meal, really the ultimate fulfillment of Passover communion we find in Revelation chapter 19, verse 9. Quote, "And the angel said to me, write this, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, these are the true words of God." End quote. Man, don't you love that last sentence? These are the true words of God. The Bible sometimes refers to the church as the bride of Christ. On one hand, it does this to show us in human terms the love and faithfulness Christ has for his church. On the other hand, it sets the level of expectation as to how a husband should treat, love, and sacrifice for his wife. Weddings worked a little bit differently back in Bible days. There would be this great feast prepared. It would be incredible. The groom would then go and get his bride from usually her parents' place and bring her back to the feast. I'm throwing that out there because in Revelation 19, the feast is prepared and Jesus comes back for his bride, the church. That all happens after the tribulation, but that's a conversation for another day. Maybe I'll do an episode unpacking that one day. Fun fact, did you know the word rapture doesn't actually show up in the book of Revelation or actually the whole Bible? Doesn't that feel noteworthy? Feels important? Anyway, back to the regularly scheduled programming. Jesus is referencing a meal, what we later learn to be a feast at the end of days. While it could 100% be a metaphor to help us wrap our minds around such thing, I think it means that one of the first things we'll do in the new heavens and the new earth is feast on the best meal that anyone has ever had, ever. I mean, can you imagine? Like, Hey, Jesus, I think we're running a little low on tacos. And he goes, let there be tacos. And there were tacos. And God saw that the tacos were good. Phew, man, doesn't that sound incredible? Okay, here we go. Back to the text. In this conversation, Jesus is pointing his disciples to a future day when the kingdom of God is fulfilled and every wrong has been made right. I know the idea of Jesus' return and the description found in Revelation 19 can be, well, startling, but this is the beginning of everything being made right, everything being made good, perfect peace and joy being a part of everyday life. How incredible does that sound? So listen, the Lord's Supper shows us his control. The Lord's Supper helps us anticipate the future. And also, the Lord's Supper reminds us of his love. Let's pick back up in verse 19, quote, "And he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, 'This is my body which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' And likewise the cup after they had eaten, saying, 'This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood.'" End quote. Jesus is the one making the sacrifice. Jesus is also the sacrifice himself. You see, the new covenant spoken of in verse 20 still demands a sacrifice, reflecting the unblemished lamb. This sacrifice has to be unblemished. That is, it has to be without sin. Hebrews chapter 10 tells us that Jesus is the permanent sacrifice. He is the one that is good for all time. So when we gather for communion or when we gather for the Lord's Supper, we are not gathering like they did for the Passover, meaning we're not gathering to make a new sacrifice. We're not gathering for anything like that. We are gathering to celebrate our for all time sacrifice, meaning we celebrate that our relationship with God can be secured, has been secured by Jesus Christ, the righteous one, that our God has freed us from sin, freed us from death, just like he freed the people of Israel from captivity in Egypt. That is what we celebrate. Throughout the Old Testament, God calls his people to look back as to how they were delivered out of Egypt. He actually does that at least 70 times. They were supposed to be continually looking back to how God had shown his power, how he had showed his faithfulness, how he had shown his love, how he defeated their enemy when they were helpless. It was when God's people forgot about God's faithfulness and the power he displayed to deliver them that they rebelled against God. And rebellion against God is rooted in failing to trust God. For us today, we must continually look back at God's goodness, at God's faithfulness that he has proven on the cross. But God proved his own love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. This is what Romans 5:8 tells us. So that when sickness, when joblessness, when loneliness, or the frustrations of life hit, we don't jump ship. We can look back to the cross and know that even though I don't know what he is doing now, I know that since he was faithful enough and loved me enough to go to the cross, then he is faithful enough to get me through this thing, that he will work through the storm. I may not like how he does it. I may not like when he does it, but I know he will do it and it will be for my ultimate good, and more importantly, is going to be to the glory of God. In this passage, Jesus is calling us to look back to how we've been delivered from death. Communion is remembering the goodness and faithfulness of God as he has demonstrated on the cross. At the end of the day, the Lord's Supper tells us that God is in control. It gives us the opportunity to stop, to look forward to the second coming, and to look back to the cross. It gives us a chance to stop and reflect, to realign our hearts that can be sinking in despair. When you're driving, sometimes your wheel could get knocked out of alignment. It could cause your car to drift to the left. It could cause your car to drift to the right. Maybe hit a curb, pothole. I don't know. But the point is, when you are out of alignment, something has to bring you back in. For the car to be safe again, it must be put into alignment. The Lord's Supper is an opportunity for us to get back into alignment. That no matter what came up and bumped us out, the Lord's Supper helps us pause, look back to the faithfulness of God, look forward to the hope that he brings, and get back in alignment.
Thanks for listening to the Steadfast Podcast. I want to remind you that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 58, Paul wrote this, quote, "Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain." End quote. So in light of biblical truth, let us be steadfast, immovable. Let us remember that through Jesus, not one labor is in vain, not one trial is in vain, not one effort in all of our lives is in vain. Because He gives purpose, and that purpose rings through eternity. That's all I've got for you today. Thank you so much for listening. And don't forget, if you've got questions you would like answered, you can email me at matt@steadfastpodcast.com.